fluorescent lights of Monroe High School's drama room flickered intermittently, casting uneven shadows across the worn wooden stage. It was 1982, and the Bronx carried the weight of urban decay like a heavy coat. Graffiti-covered subway cars rattled past cracked windows, while the distant sound of sirens provided the neighborhood's constant soundtrack. Paulette Pearson adjusted her reading glasses and glanced at the clock. 4:30 p.m. Most teachers had long since gathered their belongings and headed home, but here she was, still waiting. At 42, she had already dedicated 15 years to teaching theater arts, and her passion burned as bright as ever. "Mrs. Pearson?" A hesitant voice echoed from the doorway. She turned to see Denzel Washington, a lanky 16-year-old with curious eyes and an uncertain smile. His backpack hung loosely from one shoulder, and she could see the reluctance in his posture, the same reluctance she'd noticed when he'd signed up for her advanced theater class 3 months ago. "I wasn't sure you'd still be here," he said, stepping into the room. "I told you I'd help you with that monologue, didn't I?" Paulette's voice carried the warmth that had drawn countless students to confide in her over the years. When Paulette Pearson makes a promise, she keeps it. The afternoon sun filtered through the grimy windows, painting golden streaks across the scuffed linoleum floor. Outside, the sounds of the Bronx continued, children playing in the courtyard, the rumble of the 6 train, the occasional shout from the street. But inside this small drama room, something special was about to unfold. Denzel approached the makeshift stage, his sneakers squeaking against the floor. "I've been practicing like you said, but I still don't think I'm getting it right." Paulette had seen hundreds of students over the years, but there was something different about this young man. When he performed, even during his most uncertain moments, there was a raw authenticity that couldn't be taught. It was a gift that many actors spent their entire careers trying to develop. Yet here it was, natural and unpolished in a teenager from the Bronx. "Show me what you've been working on," she said, settling into the front row of mismatched chairs that served as their audience section. Denzel took a deep breath and began the opening lines of the monologue, from "A Raisin in the Sun." As he spoke, his voice grew stronger, more confident. Paulette watched intently, noting the way his entire body seemed to embody the character's struggles and dreams. When he finished, the room felt silent, except for the distant hum of traffic. Denzel looked at her expectantly, his hands fidgeting with the strap of his backpack. "What did you think?" he asked. Paulette stood up slowly, her expression thoughtful. "Denzel, can I tell you something? In all my years of teaching, I've met maybe 3 or 4 students who had what I call the gift. That special something that can't be taught, only nurtured." She walked closer to the stage, her eyes never leaving his. "You have that gift. You have something truly special." Denzel's eyebrows raised in surprise. "Really? I mean, I like acting and all, but I never thought—" "Listen to me carefully," Paulette interrupted, her voice taking on the firm but gentle tone she reserved for her most important lessons. "You have a talent that could take you anywhere you want to go, but talent alone isn't enough. You need to believe in yourself, work harder than everyone else, and never ever give up on your dreams." The teenager shifted uncomfortably, unused to such direct praise. In a neighborhood where dreams often felt like luxuries few could afford, Paulette's words seemed almost too big to accept. "But what if I'm not good enough? What if I fail?" he asked quietly. Paulette smiled, remembering her own doubts when she'd first started teaching. Failure isn't the opposite of success, Denzel. It's part of the journey. Every great actor has faced rejection, criticism, and doubt. What separates the ones who make it from those who don't is simple. They refuse to give up. As if to emphasize her point, the drama room's overhead lights flickered again, but neither of them seemed to notice. They were too caught up in this moment, a teacher recognizing exceptional potential and a student beginning to glimpse his own possibilities. "Will you help me?" Denzel asked. "I mean, if you have time." "Every Tuesday and Thursday after school," Paulette said without hesitation. "We'll work on technique, character development, everything you need to know. But I need something from you in return." "What's that?" "Promise me you'll never stop dreaming. Promise me that no matter what anyone else says, no matter how hard it gets, you'll remember this conversation and keep pushing forward." Denzel looked around, the modest drama room, at the peeling paint, the mismatched furniture, the small stage that had seen thousands of student perform. Then he looked back at Mrs. Pearson, this woman who barely knew him, but was willing to invest her time in his future. "I promise," he said, and for the first time since entering the room, his voice carried complete conviction. Outside, the Bronx continued its daily rhythm, unaware that in a small drama room on the third floor of Monroe High School, the seeds of something extraordinary had just been planted. 3 weeks had passed since that first afternoon, and the routine had become sacred. Every Tuesday and Thursday at 3:45 p.m., while other students rushed toward the exits, eager to escape the confines of Monroe High School, Denzel Washington made his way up the worn staircase to the third-floor drama room. The November air had grown crisp, and the radiators clanked and hissed their mechanical symphony throughout the old building. Paulette had taken to bringing a thermos of hot chocolate, not the fancy kind, just the powdered mix from the teacher's lounge. But it had become their ritual. 2 styrofoam cups, steam rising between them as they discussed everything from Stanislavski's method to the importance of truly listening to your scene partner. "Today we're going to work on something different," Paulette announced as Denzel settled into his usual spot on the edge of the stage. She pulled out a dog-eared copy of Fences by August Wilson. "I want you to read Troy Maxon's monologue about his father." Denzel took the script, his fingers tracing the worn pages. Over the past few weeks, he'd grown more comfortable in this space, more willing to be vulnerable in his performances. But this particular piece made him pause. "Mrs. Pearson, this is heavy stuff," he said, scanning the lines. "The best material usually is." She settled into her chair, the one with the squeaky left arm that she'd grown fond of despite its imperfections. "Art has the power to help us process difficult truths, Denzel. Sometimes we need to explore pain, to understand joy, examine struggle, to appreciate triumph." Outside, the familiar sounds of the Bronx afternoon drifted through the windows. Children calling to each other in the schoolyard, car horns honking in the distance, the rhythmic bounce of a basketball against concrete. But inside the drama room, a different kind of reality was taking shape. Denzel began to read, and immediately Paulette could see him wrestling with the material. The monologue dealt with generational trauma, with a son trying to understand his father's harshness, with the cycle of pain that gets passed down through families. It was subject matter that hit close to home for many young people in their neighborhood. "Stop," Paulette said gently when he stumbled over a particularly emotional passage. "What's happening to you right now?" "I don't know," Denzel admitted, setting the script down on his lap. "It's like It's like I can feel what he's feeling, but it's scary. It's too real. Paulette nodded, remembering her own early acting experiences, the moment when she'd first understood that true performance required opening doors inside yourself that you might prefer to keep closed. That's exactly where you need to be, she said. That discomfort you're feeling, that's the difference between reciting lines and actually acting. The audience can sense when someone is hiding behind words versus when someone is brave enough to live truthfully in the moment. She stood up and walked over to the small window that looked out over the courtyard. You know, when I first started teaching, I thought my job was to help students memorize lines and hit their marks. But over the years, I've realized that what I'm really teaching is courage. The courage to be vulnerable, to be honest, to show up completely, even when it's terrifying. Denzel looked up at her, this woman who had already given him more individual attention than most of his teachers combined. Is it always this hard? The work that matters usually is. She turned back to him with a smile. But here's what I've learned. When you're willing to go to those difficult places in service of the story, when you're brave enough to let the audience see your humanity, that's when magic happens. That's when you stop being Denzel Washington, reading lines, and become whatever character the story needs you to be. They worked for another hour, breaking down the monologue line by line. Paulette showed him how to find the emotional truth in each moment without forcing it, how to let his natural instincts guide him while still being precise with the text. She watched as he began to trust himself more, as he allowed the character's pain to live alongside his own experiences without being overwhelmed by either. Better, she said when he finished his third run-through. Much better. You're starting to make it your own. As they packed up their things, Denzel lingered by the door. Mrs. Pearson, can I ask you something? Always. Why do you stay so late? I mean, you could go home at 3:30 like everyone else. Why do you spend your time with me? Paulette paused, her hand on the light switch. The question touched something deep in her understanding of why she'd become a teacher in the first place. Do you know what I see when I watch you work, Denzel? He shook his head. I see someone who could change how people think about acting, about storytelling, about what it means to be truthful on stage or screen. I see someone who could inspire others the way you're inspiring me right now. She flicked off the lights and they walked together toward the stairwell. I've been teaching for 15 years and I've learned that some students cross your path to learn from you. But every once in a while, you meet a student who teaches you something about what's possible. The hallway was empty now, their footsteps echoing off the polished floors. Through the main windows, they could see the streetlights beginning to flicker on as dusk settled over the Bronx. Plus, Paulette added with a grin, when you're accepting your first Tony Award, I want to be able to say I was there when you were just getting started. Denzel laughed, the sound bouncing off the walls. A Tony Award? Mrs. Pearson, I'm just trying to get through high school. Dream bigger, Denzel, she said as they reached the main exit. Dream so big it scares you a little. That's when you know you're onto something important. They stepped out into the November evening, the cold air sharp against their faces. Paulette pulled her coat tighter and headed toward the teacher's parking lot, while Denzel walked toward the bus stop. Same time Thursday, he called out. Wouldn't miss it, she replied. As she drove home through the familiar streets of the Bronx, past the corner bodegas and the apartment buildings with their warm, glowing windows, Paulette found herself thinking about potential, about how it lived inside people, sometimes hidden, sometimes obvious, but always waiting for the right moment to bloom. She had no way of knowing that 30 years later, that same young man would remember these afternoons, these conversations, these moments when someone believed in him before he fully believed in himself. She couldn't have imagined that her investment of time and faith would one day circle back to her in the most unexpected and generous way. For now, she was simply a teacher, doing what teachers do, planting seeds and trusting that some of them will grow into something beautiful. The knock on Paulette's door came on a Tuesday afternoon. At 77, she moved slowly, her arthritis making each step deliberate. The small apartment in Washington Heights felt even smaller these days, filled with decades of teaching memories and theater programs she couldn't bear to throw away. She opened the door expecting the landlord or maybe a neighbor, but instead found herself face to face with a man whose smile she recognized instantly. "Hello, Mrs. Pearson." Paulette's hand flew to her chest. "Denzel? Denzel Washington." He stood there, older now, distinguished. But his eyes held the same warmth she remembered from that 16-year-old boy who used to stay after school. In his hands, he carried a bouquet of flowers and an envelope. "May I come in?" Her living room was modest. A worn sofa, family photos on every surface, and a small TV where she'd watched his movies over the years, always with pride. Denzel looked around, taking in the space where his former teacher lived. "I heard about your situation," he said gently. "About the rent." Paulette's eyes filled with tears. 3 months ago, when she'd received that letter from the landlord saying her rent was paid for the next 5 years, she thought it was a mistake. It was only last week that her old colleague had finally told her the truth. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did." Denzel took her hands in his. "Mrs. Pearson, do you remember what you told me that first day about never giving up on dreams?" She nodded, unable to speak. "Every role I've ever played, every award I've ever received, every moment I've stood on a stage or in front of a camera, you were there with me. Your voice, your belief, your lessons about courage and truth." He handed her the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter and a check. "The rent is just the beginning," he said. "You spent your life investing in students like me. Now it's time someone invested in you." Paulette wiped her eyes with a tissue. "I was just doing my job." "No," Denzel said firmly. "You were changing lives. You planted seeds in me that are still growing. You taught me that art matters, that truth matters, that believing in someone can change everything." They sat together in her small living room as the afternoon light faded, teacher and student, two people whose lives had intersected at exactly the right moment decades ago. "I always knew you'd do great things," Paulette whispered. "And I always hoped I'd get the chance to thank you properly," Denzel replied. "Sometimes the greatest performances happen off stage, in quiet moments when gratitude finds its way home." In a small apartment in Washington Heights, a circle that began in a Bronx drama room 38 years ago was finally complete.